the Human Rights Conference sponsored by the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. We have this afternoon our keynote speaker, Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean, who will bring us an address featuring journalism in the age of civil rights. And Dr. Brown-Dean provided us with a very brief bio that kind of skims over her vast accomplishments. She's an associate provost for faculty affairs and professor of political science at Quinnipiac University. She earned the Henry R. Spencer Award for Distinguished Teaching, the Outstanding Faculty Award, the Fannie Lou Hamer Outstanding Community Service Award, and was named one of the 25 most influential women in higher education by Diverse Magazine. Brown-Dean's work centers the importance of identity in shaping access to democracy, justice, and representation, with a particular emphasis on voting rights, civic engagement, and the politics of punishment. She is the author of Identity Politics in United States and co-author of a new project entitled Protesting Vulnerability, Race, and Pandemic Politics. I'm so excited, and we're so fortunate to have her with us here today. She is a highly sought after political analyst with contributions to the New York Times, MSNBC, LA Times, Fox News Radio, Democracy Now!, and many other outlets. She also hosts the weekly Connecticut Public Radio show and podcast, Disrupted. She is so passionate about inclusive community development, and she's the immediate past board chair of the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven. She is a 2021 Spotlight recipient for social justice leadership by the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame. She was recently named as 100 most influential African Americans in Connecticut. And what her bio doesn't tell you is that there's a Khalilah Brown-Dean Day named after her in her hometown, where she is a major celebrity. She also tweets daily about multifaceted topics, and most importantly, and I can personally attest to this, Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean is a super phenomenal woman. That really should be her superhero title. She wears many, many hats. She's wife, mom, daughter, warrior, community leader, soror, sister, gourmet chef, artist, stylist. She can dance. She's been known to spit a few bars with the late Biz Marquis. I'm just so excited about today's conversation. And without further ado, I'd like to present to you Dr. Khalilah Brown-Dean, my friend.
Thank you so much, Tanya. Whenever I'm having a bad day, I'm going to replay this audio so that I can remember what I'm capable of, according to the great Tanya Hughes. Can everyone see my screen okay? Wonderful. I do not use Teams in my daily work, so if there's a problem, just let me know. Thank you again to CHRO under the direction of your amazing executive director, Tanya Poole Hughes, and especially now in this moment where many of us feel that we are constantly on the defense and constantly under attack. The work of CHRO is incredibly important. So thank you to all of you who have gathered here today. I want to get right to the point because our time is short, but I'm also in a space where I feel like what people deserve in this moment is truth, and a truth that John Hope Franklin called the unvarnished truth. And so that truth for me is that we are in a moment where the world feels incredibly heavy. And so even for me as someone who is a political nerd and political junkie, and that is a title of being a nerd that I wear proudly. Even for me, with every new media report, with every new social media post, breaking news and controversy, we are reminded that in this moment, the fights we face today, in this so-called new era of civil rights, feels like the same old fights that our parents and our elders and our ancestors have been fighting. We collectively continue to fight for and demand access to affordable quality housing, where our identity, the structure of our families, the people whom we love does not determine whether we can live in a place where we can be safe and secure in our person and our property. We continue collectively to fight for the right to vote, that opportunity to walk into a voting booth calmly and express our membership in this democracy. We collectively continue to fight so that our children and those who are in our communities have access to a quality education that is not determined by their zip code or who their parents know in connection. And so as we fight for representation, for accurate and fair representation, whether that is in the halls of our state legislature or in various modes of pop culture, we are reminded that unfortunately, some folks seem more committed to defending the celebrities that they don't know than to affirming the people that they do know. The trans people and their families who have to justify their existence because someone would prefer to support a comedy special than to address what that comedian said, which is to say there's a difference between being laughed at and being laughed with. And when communities that are vulnerable become the target of those jokes and journalists defend that, we have to take a step back and ask where we are. The world feels heavy because our attention is always being challenged. I want you to take a moment and think about the things that you were concerned about 3 weeks ago. Now, let me say that I sometimes can't remember what I had for breakfast or why I walked into a room and I find myself going, what did I come in here for? Maybe I'm the only person. But think about collectively what was dominating our news coverage just 3 weeks ago. Many of us were concerned about the crisis at the border. We were outraged by how Haitian migrants were being treated. We were concerned about how Afghan refugees would reach safety and security outside of the country that they loved. And so quickly, our attention has now turned to things that are much more mundane and things that in the grand scheme of things don't really matter. And so let me be abundantly clear. I am not a journalist. What I am is a storyteller who has the opportunity to apply my public scholarship to tell those stories across all platforms, across radio, television, print, and now increasingly in social media, to think about what are the stories that need to be told and how do we tell them in a fair and accurate way. And so Tanya mentioned this new radio show and podcast that I host for Connecticut Public Radio. We have now just surpassed our 1-year mark with growing ratings across those platforms. And so thank you to all of you who have supported the show and many of you who I see in the participant list who have been on the show with us. As a kid, journalists allowed me to imagine a world beyond my small hometown. It allowed me to connect to ideas, to people, and to possibilities beyond the realm of my familiar. It allowed me to understand why the park that was in my neighborhood used to be home to a bustling public pool that my elders talked about. And now when I would go to the park, it was little more than an empty cement place filled with bricks and dirt and empty beer cans, no longer a source of respite for those humid Virginia summers, journalists told the story about what it meant for the US Supreme Court to say integration had to happen. And rather than comply with those mandates, local officials decided to close the pool entirely. Journalists helped me connect to what was happening at home, but also across the world to understand apartheid in South Africa. It was because of the stories that journalists told that I gave up my favorite soda as a kid, because journalists told the stories of how that US beverage company that I will not name benefited from apartheid in South Africa. I was convinced at 10 that if that company would not divest from that awful practice, they couldn't have the 50 cents that I would give in the general store. Imagine being able to get something for 50 cents these days. And so because of journalists, the possibility of journalists and journalism to connect us to those stories, it also reminds us that in this moment where we are battling with two crippling pandemics, COVID-19 that has disproportionately taken the lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, as well as a crippling epidemic of racial violence that has robbed the lives of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more. In this moment, the question is not what journalism needs to do in this era of new civil rights, but what we collectively must do to affirm that. And so in the time that I have, here are the three major points that I want to share with you today. First, we have to elevate community voices. It matters not just the stories that get told, but who is telling those stories with integrity and authenticity. My second point is that we collectively need to promote media literacy. It is easy for us to do our own research when often that means going into the silos to find sources that simply agree with us. If we diversify our media diet, we make healthier choices about what we consume. We can reach together the third point, which allows us to affirm our collective humanity. When I think about journalism and how journalists can write freedom and conspire with us to do so, I immediately think of Ida B. Wells, who said the people must know before they can act, and there is no educator to compare with the press. Ida B. Wells was a feminist who had the audacity to believe that women, all women, deserved safety, freedom, and protection. Ida B. Wells was also an abolitionist who was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi, but knew that her father, with his limited formal education, was the wisest person she had ever met, in spite being denied the ability to learn to read. Ida B. Wells' father, with his limited formal education, went on to create an institution of higher learning that still exists in Mississippi, now called Rust College. Ida B. Wells was a prolific author who understood the power of communication to bring people together, but it was the murder of her friend that helped her to understand that early movement of civil rights had to be captured. Tarana Burke, the founder of the Me Too movement, says, watch who they call your leaders. Ida B. Wells understood that if journalists were going to dignify the communities they were concerned in, they had to be leaders to tell those stories. Ida B. Wells' friend was accused of theft, although he was a very successful business owner and entrepreneur. He was accused of theft, a petty crime. He and two friends, business partners, were arrested, thrown into jail. An angry mob broke into that jail, kidnapped them, and publicly lynched them as a symbol of those boundaries. Ida B. Wells wrote about that awful practice of lynching, but also wrote about the lynching of women and girls that was happening across the South and across the US. Ida B. Wells understood the power of a picture and of an image, but also the need to place that into context. This is a picture from 1964. It was taken just days after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was written into law. And I know at CHRO how important that act is to governing the ways that you support people across our state. This picture was taken because a 15-year-old Black boy was shot and killed by an off-duty white officer in New York. It led to protests in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, also in Harlem. And some mainstream journalists came to those neighborhoods and accused the residents of being violent rioters set on looting and destroying, even though the people in the neighborhood said, this has been happening too long. If we don't speak up, no one will take this seriously, and they will say that we were complicit in our harm. That's 1964. Sound familiar to where we are today? And so it was grassroots journalists at the Amsterdam News, at Ebony Magazine, and other publications who said, we have to tell the story to really understand what is happening, because they understood the power of language and imagery within journalism. And I apologize in advance. I know this is a very difficult image to see, but sometimes we become so comfortable and complacent in where we are today that we forget what it took for us to get here. These three young men who went to Mississippi to register new voters, to give access to health, to education, all the protections of American democracy, were murdered for doing that. Some journalists called them troublemakers, said that they came from the North to the South to disrupt what was happening. And so what happened to them, according to some journalists, was the natural result of others feeling like they were threatened by outsiders. Again, sound familiar? And so when journalists capture the story of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, those same journalists raised those same questions about John Lewis and his colleagues who gathered in Selma, Alabama for a nonviolent march, a silent march, and yet were met by state-sanctioned violence. John Lewis, who we now revere as the late Congressman John Lewis, suffered permanent brain damage and injury, because the story that was told is that these young people were coming and upsetting things, and that their presence was a threat to what was happening. Now, I know that we are in Connecticut and in New England, and we like to think of ourselves as being more sophisticated than those Southerners. We like to think of ourselves as being more understanding and connected than people in those other places. But what we see in Connecticut is this confluence between political debates and how media covers not just those debates, but what is at stake within those issues. So this is a flyer that is circulated about increased concerns about theft, about car thefts in particular, and about the role of juveniles in much of that. And so a recent report that came from the Accountability Project at Connecticut Public Radio found that within those political debates and the coverage of those issues, media outlets here in the state of Connecticut overwhelmingly cover that issue as one involving white residents in suburban neighborhoods who become the victims of crimes committed by youth of color from the cities. So how that then plays out to where we are is also how we use language. I want you to take a moment to think about what comes to mind when you hear the word riot versus what comes to mind when you hear the word protest, right? So that when people think of a riot, they are most likely going to think about, and again, this is not my opinion, this is the data-driven research that has been done on this. When people think of a riot, they are most often thinking about things that happen in urban areas, most likely committed by people of color or people who feel underrepresented in other dynamics. And there's often the moral judgment that is made about that behavior. And when we hear the word riot, rarely do we think of what happened in a Storrs, Connecticut, for example, after a team lost a national championship. Rarely do we think about what happened in Pennsylvania after a football team won a Super Bowl. And yet that language that is conveyed in media through imagery, through who gets to speak in stories and the context, then shapes our connections to each other. And so the second key point related to this as we translate in is, again, back to that idea that who tells the story is often as important as the story that is told. The image that is on your screen is of a young woman named Aya Galal. I will tell you I'm a bit biased because Aya is a former student of mine, but even if she was not, I have such profound respect for this young woman. Aya is one of few women in this country who are journalists, on-air reporters who wear hijab on air, one of few and perhaps the youngest. And Aya will tell you the vitriol that was sent her way, the ignorance, the attacks and the threats sent her way just by her very presence. And so what does it mean then when we say we need to tell these stories accurately, and yet newsrooms across the country reflect that? Second big point then is that we need to promote media literacy. Again, this is not about what journalists need to do, but about what we need to do. 1983, there were over 50 major media companies in this country that controlled much of the news that we had access to as people in this country. Today, in 2021, that is now at 6. So 50 companies in the 1980s, now only 6 companies control 90% of what we read, what we watch, and what we listen to. And that means then that those 6 companies can control the media diet for the overwhelming majority of people in this country. This person who is on our screen is a man named Jacob Blake, which many of you may remember. Jacob Blake was shot in the back in Kenosha, Wisconsin last year while his children were in the car with him begging for their father's life. This happened in Kenosha. It happened in the broader context of a divisive political space of uprisings happening across the country and conflicts in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And so the media story immediately went to, let's dig into his background to see what he may have done to cause the harm and injury, permanent injury that he has suffered. And so it talked about his past record. It talked about his family. It made all kinds of allegations in the coverage because too often journalistic accounts decide who gets to wear the mantle of being a victim and often who has to defend the harm that they have suffered. And yet, this young man, Kyle Rittenhouse, who is now charged with felony homicide, and the murder of 2 people in Kenosha and the significant injury to a third, these are all pulls from actual media accounts that happened there. This young man who did not live in Kenosha, did not live in Wisconsin, came there. You see him with his weapons there, and the media couldn't figure out what to call him, even though he had just murdered 2 people that was captured on video. Some called him the American vigilante because he said, I'm fed up with what's happening. I'm fed up with the destruction. I'm going to take this into my own hands. Others called him a domestic terrorist, saying it is terroristic to injure, harm, and kill so many people because of a political view. And other media outlets referred to him as a volunteer who simply showed up to make things better and had to protect himself. And now what we have today, as that trial proceeds, and as you can see was just 2 days ago, the judge has said that the prosecutors cannot refer to the 2 people who were killed as victims, but calling them looters or rioters could be okay. And so when journalists then weigh in on these political divisions, these legal matters, those images are important. We remember this, or some of you may remember this, I may be dating myself, from 2005 after Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, and particularly out of New Orleans, where the pictures call people engaging in the same activity looters versus those who were finding, although they were engaged in the very same activity. Words matter. The language used by journalists matter for how we all respond. January 6th, do we call this a riot? Do we call it an insurrection? Is it an attempted coup? Is it a peaceful protest that simply got out of hand? And then who gets to decide? And finally, as we think about journalism in this new era of civil rights, it is important that we together affirm our collective humanity. What do I mean by that? It means that as we are increasing our media literacy, as we are thinking about the sources that we rely on for information, it is critical that we affirm and empower and uplift the voices who are from communities that too often get overlooked, get rejected, or get marginalized. And so I have to give a shout out to my colleagues at Quinnipiac University who have launched the Ability Media Project. It is a platform to represent the over 50 million people in this country who are living with different levels of ability, yet are too often erased or marginalized within journalism. To have people who are neurodivergent talking about the challenges of returning to in-person learning through this pandemic and what it means to have those voices centered, what it means then to have GLAAD put out this media reference guide so that the media sources dominating the space are accurate and respectful in how they cover trans communities. Recent report from Brown University found that of the 90% of trans people who were part of this particular study who saw or heard negative representations of trans communities in media, they were strongly correlated with increased rates of depression, of suicidal ideation, and of PTSD. Words matter, so that when a person dies, we are not dead naming them in journalism, and we as consumers are rejecting that. To think about the terms that we use, not based on what we like, but the fundamental opportunity for people to be respected. And so I'll finally end by saying here that we can talk about journalism and this new era of civil rights. We can call out those who we think don't do it well, or those who we think are capturing the essence of what's happening in our country right now. But I want to affirm that the greatest power, the greatest sense of agency to tell those stories, to demand accuracy and fairness and representation rest on all of us. Not just what we choose to listen to or choose to view or choose to read, but also the ways in which we support those outlets, arenas, journalists, and storytellers who are doing it well. So I will end there and turn it back over to you, Tanya Hughes, please.
Well, Dr. Brown-Dean, my friend, you did not disappoint.
Thank you.
At all. I truly believe that you have earned your title of super phenomenal woman. I'm so excited about today's conversation, and I wanted to kick off the questions because, as you know, there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about critical race theory and about it being taught in elementary schools, which we know is not happening. But I wanted to know, what are your thoughts surrounding this, especially as it pertains to the teaching of race history imposing guilt upon the dominant race, if you will?
You know, I've been in school for a very long time. I went from undergrad directly into a PhD program. So I know education in various levels, and never in any of my undergraduate studies, certainly not K through 12, did I ever get taught critical race theory. And I've been educated by some of the most profound thinkers in that space.
Right.
So the idea that a kindergartner will be taught critical race theory is absurd. But what it taps into is the realization that fear is a powerful force in this country. Whether it is rational or irrational, fear is powerful. And when you can play on the fears that people have about being erased or about being overlooked or about having to loosen the grips on power and control, that fear can make people act in irrational ways. And that means that I think as parents, as educators, as community members, yes, you have the right to have a say in the curriculum and the education that your child is learning from. What you don't have the right to do is to then threaten school board members or to threaten other people because you disagree. That is actually the antithesis of what we say we value in this country as a democracy. And then journalists have the obligation to tell those stories in their truth. If you want to know what critical race theory is, call Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually authored this. Read her book, read a primer. You can go online. I read a lot of things I don't agree with because I need to be informed so that I'm not arguing from a point of ignorance. And I think that again goes back to what we as people owe to ourselves and to our state and our communities to be informed.
Correct. So you spoke about the media diet and the use of language and how important it is not only how you tell the story, but who tells the story. And it makes me think about our former president who used that fear that you spoke of very well. And it has kind of led us to the place where we are now. What I'd like to know is how do we infuse more of a balanced diet? How do we force more of a balanced coverage by the media? How can we increase the storytellers so that it's more diverse and force them to tell that it's not the looters, it's the peaceful protesters versus the rioters?
Mhm. You know, I want to push back a little bit to what you just said. I think our former president was able to elevate and escalate what was already happening in our country, right? Um, I said before, I'm from Virginia. I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia. I know what it felt like to see people on the campus of my alma mater with tiki torches screaming racist, anti Semitic slogans. That doesn't happen overnight. People don't just wake up and say, I think today I'm going to go do this. That is a brewing that happens. And so what that means then is, I often hear people criticize mainstream media as being biased, and they are. And they are because they are made up of people, and all people are biased in different ways. So there's no such thing as an unbiased media source, right? For their best intentions, humans are inherently biased. The goal then is for us to be able to say, as consumers, can I recognize that bias and can I balance that bias? And then I can take away what I have there. The other thing I think in terms of how we do this is think about the conversation that happened around vaccines in Connecticut. And immediately the claim was it's about vaccine hesitancy. There are lower rates of vaccinations in communities of color because the communities are hesitant to do so. Instead of saying, wait a minute, maybe it's about access. Maybe it's about building trust so that communities say, don't just show up one day and tell me what you think I need, cultivate a relationship with me. What does it mean for people who have physical impairment, physical mobility issues to be able to get to sites? But the media narrative immediately placed people as complicit in the harm that they were suffering, as opposed to saying, how can we be agents of that? So it doesn't mean that you have to watch the 6 o'clock news to get what's going on, but it also means you cannot get all of your news from Instagram and Twitter.
Thank you for that. I am going to not monopolize this conversation because I get you all the time. I'm going to turn this over to Attorney Cheryl Sharp, who has some burning questions she has for you as well.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your presentation. I have been texting during some of it saying that this is phenomenal, the history that you've provided, the information that you are giving to the audience is amazing. I have a couple of questions for you. And one is that in certain ways, I feel as though people of color, Black and brown people, BIPOC people have to live a life that's interrupted by racism, as exhibited through some of the images that you showed. How can media address that, where we can get to a place where our life isn't, constantly being interrupted by racism, by lack of correct information being disseminated, by the decimation of history so that we can't talk about it. There are in so many ways that that life is constantly interrupted. Walking outside, going to the store, going to the gas station, going to school, going to work. And then how do we spread the message? Because I think that there are a lot of sympathetic and empathetic people who, if they understood how our lives were interrupted by racism so often, that they would join in a movement to change things for us. I know that was a really long-winded question, but
No, listen, if you have the answer to that question, you just got a MacArthur Genius Award, right? Because it is a long-standing challenge in this country. I'm interested in global media and representations, but there's something unique about the role of journalism and media here in the United States. Two things to that. One, media is a reflection of us, right? It is a reflection of what we are demanding and what we are accepting. So if a journalistic enterprise knows that the sensational is what sells papers, the sensational is what draws audience and viewers, the extremism is what draws people in to say viewers, I'm going to be a little biased here. I never really thought that TMZ would be the go-to credible source for breaking news in this country. But when Prince died, I'm a Prince fan. I went to TMZ to see could they confirm this because the other outlets were going into this whole space that got me away from that. So media outlets know they give us what we demand. So there's a way for us to change that. Toni Morrison says the function of racism, the fundamental function of racism is to distract us from the work. And the us that Toni Morrison is talking about is all of us, not just Black folks, but all of us. And so if we think about that, the ways in which it keeps people from focusing on the things that bring them joy and purpose and security, then we start to say, you know what? I actually would like to go through my day of social media and not be reminded of somebody else's ignorance, or not have to hear a story of a child in Texas whose locks were cut off because a district decided that they couldn't have ownership over their body. I would like to have that. But even if I turn off the TV or stop social media, it's still happening. So the allies, the co-conspirators, have to come together to say, let's address the issues that media is reporting, as opposed to holding media to a standard that we don't hold ourselves to. That's a process, but we also have precedent. We saw that last year. We've seen it in different spaces across Connecticut. And I will not give up the fundamental hope that we will see more of it. And my hope, though, is that we see more of it, not in response to tragedy, but it's something that we proactively cultivate.
Thank you for that, because that when you say that we proactively cultivate it, that's what I think our agency is trying to do, is to get in front of tragedies so that they don't occur. we want to have outreach events so people understand the law and they don't discriminate against individuals, so that right now we're getting, thousands upon thousands of complaints of discrimination filed. We'd rather educate and train so that we don't get those thousands and thousands of complaints, because there's harm at the end of the day to those cases that are filed with us that are found to be meritorious. There are victims, right, of illegal discrimination, and so we want to try to prevent that. We want to have community engagement so that parents feel empowered and they understand the law and they know that they can file a complaint of discrimination, so that maybe it changes the policies and procedures within schools. And so it is, allyship is so important, right? And how do we collectively bring all of our allies together so that we can make this demand that you're speaking of? We have Attorney Spencer Hill, who is one of the co-organizers of this conference, and I want to shift to him. I have a bunch of questions, but like Tanya, I feel like I can ask them, and we want to make sure, we want to make sure that others who have questions can ask them, and others who have put them in the chat. So, Spencer, where?
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. So, and thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean. We have a question from Laura Roxbury. Are you in favor of some kind of regulation for Facebook and social media, since so many people now use these sites for their news source? Or do you have a solution on that?
So I'm going to give an answer that may not be satisfying, because the whole challenge is not satisfying to me. I believe in free speech. I believe that censorship, and let me be clear, when I say free speech, I mean governmental intervention in that, right? People use the term free speech when they're talking about people to people. That's not what I mean here. So I'm always concerned about when people decide a harm has been caused, or a harm that merits rising to something that government says, all of a sudden government is concerned about these things. That always gives me pause. At the same time, the amount of misinformation and disinformation that proliferates sites like Facebook is more than just, the uncle at Thanksgiving who says something ridiculous and you kind of dismiss it. This is corrosive to our American democracy. It is often violent and it is often dangerous. And so I think the ways in which those algorithms, we're about to do a show in 2 weeks on Disrupted, an episode about TikTok, and about how, the algorithms used in TikTok and also YouTube is creating sites of harm for young people. So I think something has to be done to intervene in that way. I think the question becomes, what is the something that is being done, and what's the level to do it? Facebook has zero incentive to do it, because we live in a capitalistic society where if they can make money, they will. But to your question, Laura, I know that I have reported things on Facebook and on social media, and it's not been received in the same way of, oh, that's not that serious. And then these things keep reappearing. So I agree with you there. It has corroded the public conversation in a way that I often wonder, is the overall existence worth the potential for harm?
Great. And we have one more question that I was texted. It is about kind of national journalists and speaking to politicians. Do you have any kind of suggestions or ideas on how journalists can hold politicians to account more effectively when discussing issues of race and racism?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important things that needs to happen is that we need to diversify who those journalists are. Who's in the room asking those questions and holding people accountable, as opposed to trying to figure out, how can I get a soundbite or a zinger that can get me more premium placement? To have journalists in the room when a discussion is happening with a politician about, the so-called bathroom bill. to have someone in the room who can push back to say, listen, this is not about bathrooms. This is about people being able to exist without having someone else regulate that existence or have someone else define your placement because they don't agree. So to have people who can push back against that, to model what it means to be informed, and to also model to be able to say, I can put my personal views aside while still relying on the information, the authenticity, and the connection that I have. That has to be done in a way that is more fruitful and not enough for these outlets to say, oh, we've got one person, we're good. We've got this one person who's going to be the representative for all things diversity, and we can check the box and say we did it. Because what also happens then is that it's unfair to those journalists because they get pigeonholed and aren't allowed to really push as well.
Absolutely. All right, and we are just over our time, so thank you very much. This has been great. Yes, I don't see any more questions. All right, Tanya, do you want to just say
I just want to thank you, Dr. Brown-Dean, for allowing me to lean on the shield. Friendship is so important. I met Dr. Brown-Dean a number of years ago when she first arrived to New Haven, and I knew immediately she was a force to be reckoned with, and I wanted to befriend her, and I did. And she's a phenomenal mother and a wonderful cook. So I'm just dropping hints, and Thanksgiving is coming.
I was going to say, you said that twice now. I feel like there's a lead up to, but I have you. And I just want to say again, thank you for this opportunity. But more importantly, thank you for the work that's being done at CHRO and all of the partner allies, organizations, and individuals who are working in their spaces to say, if we're going to get this thing right, we have to do it together. So I thank everyone for being a part of the conversations and what you will continue in your panels this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right, and with that, we are going to go into a short break before our next panels begin. The next panels will begin at 1 p.m., so just about 13 minutes from now. The links to the next workshops right now. Again, they're also available on our website, www.ct.gov/chro. So we will look forward to seeing everyone again in about 13 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.